All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Scholar and Gentleman Study Pub and living rooms around the country, where we are discussing Book 4 of Dostoevsky's great novel, The Brothers Karamazov. This actually begins part 2 of the book, and this particular section is called Strains, where we start to see some friction. And I think this is particularly a really insightful kind of psychological section of the book, which I think starts to hone in on some really sort of self-destructive tendencies in the human soul pretty insightfully. So I'm really excited to talk about this section. It's kind of a breakaway from the main action of the book. We're kind of dealing with more of the side characters and kind of some really interesting and colorful, surprising kinds of interactions between them. So we'll kind of work our way through an order of the chapters, and it's kind of interesting. I'm going to lead with a question that Melissa supplied. This first chapter, Father Farapont, we see a contrast between the elder Zosima and this very stern and ascetic monk considered his rival, Father Farapont. So here's Melissa's question: Zosima versus Farapont. Why is this contrast significant? And why is this contrast the start of a book entitled Strains? So let's talk about these two figures and what you took away from that. Why are we introduced to Father Farapont?
Well, I think that since Dostoevsky is always trying to portray things with both sides, you know, the great thing about Dostoevsky is anytime he's getting into an argument, he never gives a weak form of an argument. There are no straw mans in Dostoevsky. And I feel like since we talked from the very beginning about the tradition of the elders and how we felt about that, I think that in the conflict between Zosima and Farapont, you can see how the elder system could be both wonderful and terrible. Because I don't know about you, but I think I would want to go Socrates on myself before Farapont is my elder. That's just me, though. But as for why it's called Strains, I don't know. I'd have to think about that a little bit more. But I think that just for the most part, I think that since fatherhood is an underlying theme of so much that's going on, I think Dostoevsky wanted to present us a novel where, you know, the one religious clerical father figure is, you know, it would be too easy just to have the one religious clerical type father figure to be saintly, right? I think that would be the easy way out in some ways. So he presents both sides. He presents the side of where I think Zosima, who I think is like awesome, and I wish he were real, but you know, I wish I could go visit him right now. And then there's Farapont, who terrifies me. By the way, I think I've actually met Farapont in real life. Yeah, he was a Dominican that we gave the nickname of Savonarola. But anyway, so I don't know. I think that's like the easy explanation. But I don't know, Strains. I'd be very much interested in hearing what other people have to say about that particular choice.
I thought Farapont is a blur or an amalgamation of the guy who is proselytizing at every public event and everyone you've met who you know, twists religious power for something odd. It was surprising to read. You know, Zosima's, you know, in his dying kind of narrative there is talking about in a rambling fashion like the Gospels and how to be good, and then, you know, this monk comes before his rival and he's like, you see the devils everywhere, and why are you asking me stupid questions? It was really shocking. It was confusing and off-putting. And
remember, there's no such thing as stupid questions, just stupid people. And And that's a Chris Heron quote.
Junior Bear agrees.
I actually heard a different version of the Chris Heron quote, which was to me, which is, there are no foolish questions, only the fools who ask them. But that's just, that was my...
That's probably a more mature statement. I believe this came from high school, so...
Well, I believe him telling me that, though, may be on tape, like on a lecture that's on YouTube somewhere, so I might be able to actually find the footage. So.
I mean, is my mic working?
Yeah, you're on.
Okay. For some reason, the little green bars weren't showing up. Maybe we should circle back because, I mean, I think talking about the contrast between Father Farapon and Zosima is interesting. I asked that question, but as I'm re-looking at Zosima's whole speech there, I think so much of it is a really interesting contrast to all the strains we're going to see. But maybe it'd be better to talk about some of all the strains and then come back to talking about why he has this totally other vision. Does that make sense? Because I'm clearly seeing all these connections. But I think it might help to talk about some of the other chapters before I could talk about that.
So you're suggesting we skip ahead and talk about stuff and then come back to...
I mean, unless other people have stuff to say right now, because I have a lot of things I want to say, but I think we're going to like branch off and then keep talking about each individual character with all the questions you'd come up with. So
I would just say one thing.
Yeah.
That after having read it, it seemed like Zosima's kind of speech reflects Alyosha's intentions and dreams, and his rival Farapont reads like the world he's actually going to walk into. So that's how I saw it. Kind of his intentions versus the minefield of humanity he's about to walk into.
I guess, I mean, I can just go ahead and say it's like in Father Zosima's speech, he has all of these key ideas that I think are going to come up more and more in the book, and I can say that without spoilers. But like one that you've already brought up, McG, that comes right out of the liturgy, that idea of being guilty on behalf of all and for all, right? Like that idea comes up, and he's linking that to this idea of none of us should have pride. And those two things, I think, are, I hadn't thought about this until this moment. Like, I think those are a direct contrast to the way all the other characters in this chapter are basically going to go crazy. Like, they aren't able to see themselves as guilty on behalf of all and for all and as a worse sinner than everyone because they don't have that idea. They feel guilt all the time. They feel pride, and they kind of go crazy. But see, that's like, none of this makes sense without talking about the other characters and how I'm interpreting those characters first.
Well, I mean, this is what comes first in the book, so
yeah.
Maybe it's worth spending some time about what did Zosima say and what do you make of it. I mean, this particular statement in the speech is pretty striking. I imagine it sounds pretty strange when he's talking about the monk, when he knows that he is not only worse than all those in the world, but is also guilty before all people, on behalf of all and for all human sins, the world's and each person's. Only then will the goal of our unity be achieved. For you must know, my dear ones, that each of us is undoubtedly guilty on behalf of all and for all on earth, not only because of the common guilt of the world, but personally, each one of us, for all people, and for each person on this earth. This knowledge is the crown of the monk's path, and every man's path on earth. For monks are not a different sort of men, but only such as all men on earth ought also to be. Only then will our hearts be moved to a love that is infinite, universal, and that knows no satiety. Only then each of us will be able to gain the whole world by love and wash away the world's sins with his tears. What did you guys think about that? What did that statement, did you just move on? Is that just bizarre, or what did you think there?
From what I read, it struck me a lot. Some of these orthodox things strike me as like if I read Sartre, and when someone is accountable, they're accountable for all mankind. It struck me as there was a parallel between something that I read and enjoy greatly. But
oh, that's interesting. I'm not familiar with that side of Sartre, but that does sound parallel in a way.
It's from existentialism as a humanism, and it's you know, that Christians and existentialists share this notion that they're not that different in terms of when you choose for everyone.
Anyone else have any particular reactions to this passage?
Well, I guess. Oh, go ahead.
No, that's okay. Go ahead.
Well, when I first read this, I was having my first experience of people who did live monastically. And I guess for me, even though it was Western monasticism instead of Orthodox monasticism, it seemed to me that it was just a fairly common idea. Like, it's a fairly common idea for men in religious life to take the notion that they are guilty of everything. I mean, and that's also why I feel like with my experience of them, I was able to feel like I was not being judged for anything about the way I was, simply because they kind of had the attitude of, had they been in different circumstances, that, you know, they're coming from the idea of, if I have done this, and then I'm forgiven by grace. If I haven't done this, I've only haven't done this because of grace. So therefore, I'm not superior to anybody else. And so, I don't know, maybe I glossed over it just because it seemed awfully familiar to, like, a typical, like, particularly a contemplative monastic attitude. Maybe not so much. I don't know if you're like a Franciscan out in the world constantly serving the poor, or a missionary of charity, for thinking about that as much. But for those who are cloistered and spend a lot of time thinking about how they are representing the world or interceding in the world for their prayers, it just seemed like a fairly standard. It seemed like a fairly standard concept. So I don't know. Maybe.
Though your experience is not a fairly standard experience, I would say. You know, having actually spent some time in the monastic world, that's kind of rare these days. So.
Well, I just figured since there are so many Orthodox people around in the group that it would be kind of more the norm, but I forget that not everyone is McG and Taggy, so.
Ginny, did you have something you were about to say?
Yeah, well, sort of. I was trying to come up with something. The passage that you read really, really struck me, but I'm not sure I can form a very intelligible, like, cohesive thought about it. But I think it's interesting that so far we've mentioned, you know, that being common to kind of monastic way of thought. And then I'm not familiar with Sartre or existentialism really, but apparently there's parallels there. And what struck me is that it sounded very familiar, and I don't know enough to place a name to it, but a lot of the more naturalistic, you know, kind of pagan sorts of religions, like everything in nature is interconnected, everyone is interconnected, there's a universal whole. I mean, that shows up in a lot of, you know, what we think of as pagan religions. It shows up in, I had something else on the top of my head. I don't know, but it shows up a lot of different places, a lot of, like Taoism, everything in life is a balance, is kind of a variation on the theme. I mean, I feel like it's not something that's specific to Christianity. Maybe the way of framing it as guilt and forgiveness and grace is more specifically Christian, but the idea of everyone being interconnected is not. That was a lot of rambling, but
no, thank you for that. I appreciate that. I'm posing these questions because I remember when I first read this book, and I found this passage downright shocking. I was like, well, how can I be guilty for someone else's sins? You know, I thought that was bizarre, and I'm sort of surprised that this group seems to have taken that one in stride.
The other thing that I do, now that you say that, remember when I read it earlier, it seems very indicative of. I'm sorry, I'm losing all my words tonight. I was like, I have an idea, I just don't have the words to express it. It's very opposed to the idea of being holier than thou. It's very opposed to what I think are sometimes more traditional Western Christian views of like, I'm good with God, I'm right with Jesus, I have a personal relationship, I'm good. You all sinners are something else. It's very different than that.
Yeah, definitely.
I think it's I would say evangelical, kind of approach, more than a necessarily all Western Christianity approach.
Yeah, it's definitely not all Western Christianity. It's just the pieces of Western Christianity that leave a nasty taste in my mouth.
Which is many.
Yeah.
I would say most.
Well, I think I remember. Oh, go ahead, Aaron. Sorry.
I was gonna say I read this. I'm not a literature person. I'm a game theorist, and I think if you introspect for 30 seconds about what we are in the world, is if you think about how you're strategically linked with everyone else, then when you know that you are guilty and other people are guilty, I think that could that kind of introspection causes us to treat others differently, rather than treating yourself like you're on an island, whether that's a good island or a bad island. I think if you think how we're linked together, my field, teaches how to think that way. No man's
an island.
But we often feel that way, right? I mean, that's a very capitalist thing. It's a very evangelical thing. It's it's about the self, and it's maybe for some that's a radically external notion to think that way through other people's eyes and as an interconnected, superorganism of humanity rather than just yourself.
Well, and I think I'm a particularly weird specimen of Christianity in a lot of ways, because I grew up in a very Calvinist light world, where I've had many long fights about whether Calvinism falls under evangelicalism. Beside the point. Either way, I'm saying I grew up in a very particular worldview that, and now I live in this Orthodox world, so I can kind of see all these different phases. To me, this, I think, was a really radical idea, because the Calvinist worldview is definitely not one of imagining, like, it's weird because everyone talks about how dark it is, but I don't think it's ever this idea of remembering constantly that I am the worst of all people, and that's not self-flagellation or destruction, right? I think that to me was like, I grew up in this world where Catholicism was suspect, Orthodoxy was suspect, like all those liturgical, like, why would you do that? We want to be simple. And I think there was this skepticism of the sort of self-flagellating tendencies and martyrdom and all that stuff. I feel like I'm rambling now too, but I just feel like I did grow up in a world that isn't the conventional. When people think evangelical, I think they're thinking like Baptist or some of the, I grew up in this very logical, rigid world, but I still felt like there was this emphasis on like, you must be good. Like there was just this relentless push to like, you must be good, and like worrying about if you were being good enough. And one of the things that has been so radical to me about living in the Orthodox world for the past 5 years, it's like, and listen, nobody's perfect. It's not like you go into an Orthodox church and everyone is like, yay, remembering this all the time. But the ideal that's set before us every single Sunday, right before you take communion, is to say that, I brought this up in our last conversation, like, I am the first of all sinners, which just, to a Calvinist, is a real weird worldview, right? Like, it's not self-flagellating. It's just saying, I'm as bad as anybody else, and I'm going to remember this at the most holy moment and the most celebratory moment. So I feel like there's some of that paradox, because Zosima strikes me as someone that's very full of joy, even as he's dying. He's not saying like, oh, like, you're guilty for all, like, go weep in a room somewhere, right? Like, it's... So again, I feel like I just rambled a whole bunch, but this passage is so precious to me and so exciting.
Can I note that Jenny and Melissa have both said this. I don't think either of you have rambled at all. So just
But if you want to call it a ramble, that's fine, but it also completely hits on the central point, which is the view is Eucharistic, in the sense that the reason why someone is the worst of sinners is because just as Christ takes on the sin of the world, the monk through the Eucharist is participating with that action. So it's the idea of taking on the sin of the world is not just I am the worst of sinners, it's also I'm also along with Christ accomplishing the salvation of the world. So it's the fact that those two things, for Zosima, those two things are always happening at the same time. Because when you read about the monk is not only guilty of all, he's also the one along with God who is saving the world. So those two things never are separate. So by saying that in that ramble, you've actually hit on the essential point of what it's all about.
And I think like the reason I got so excited when I was rereading this and was thinking about like the connection to the idea of strain is I think so many of the characters we're going to see in the next few chapters are being shredded in half by guilt on the one hand and pride on the other, right? And they're being like destroyed by this feeling. They either have to triumph over someone or they have to like completely debase themselves. And Zosima seems to be offering this paradoxical alternative where like, yeah, recognize that you have messed up just more than any other person, and that can allow you to be humble and then maybe be happy. So there's my thesis for the whole rest of the section, which I know some people are not going to agree with, but I've like, every character is either just like being way too proud or like, I'm the worst and I'm not going to throw myself in a ditch. And they're all making themselves miserable for that reason.
Well, I think, Melissa, it's really important that you pointed out the difference between admitting guilt and self-flagellation, because too often people see those as the same thing. Like if I'm going to admit guilt, I have to beat myself up about it. And this offering, as you said, a paradox where you can admit guilt and not self-flagellate is a line that I think most characters, and I would say most people, don't know how to walk.
Yeah.
Man, you guys have said so many good things. I've wanted to chime in, but I didn't want to interrupt what was happening. And now I have like 6 different points to make.
But you won't ever say that you're rambling, will you? So.
You'll have to tell me. Let's see. I just, back to my original reading, back when I was a Lutheran in college reading this, I just remember being shocked by this idea of being guilty for all on behalf of all. I was like, what does that even mean? That seems mysterious and impossible and bizarre. And I thought it sounded kind of depressing and, maybe the self-flagellating idea that you've brought up. I was like, that point of view has certainly changed. I was glad that some of you highlighted some of the notions of the interconnectedness of all people and all things. And I think that's actually a very deep theme in Orthodox Christianity that's maybe not as prevalent in some other varieties. Is the idea of the interconnectedness of all people and with all creation, and that that salvation is not a personal event, but a kind of transfiguration of the whole cosmos. And, certainly Zosima's notion of identifying this inward responsibility for everything else in the world doesn't lead him to despair, doesn't lead him to give up and say, I should just be destroyed or I quit. He says, this is the crown of the monk's path, and only then will our hearts be moved to a love that is infinite, universal, and knows no satiety. So for him, it's about discovering, I think, the connection we have with all people, that we're all alike in this sort of inward brokenness. And that's the way that we learn to not to judge other people and to have a hope for actually being united. So that's pretty interesting. I want to make a comment on Mike's very good point that this is a Eucharistic statement. This language on behalf of all and for all is a direct excerpt from the Orthodox liturgy from the moment when the Eucharist is elevated and is being blessed, and we consider the transformation to be occurring to the body and blood of Christ. So the actual phrase in the liturgy is your own of your own we offer to you on behalf of all and for all. And the idea is that we're offering back to God exactly what he gave us, Jesus Christ, on behalf of all and for all. So we don't really have anything to give of our own, but everything we've got, we're giving it back on behalf of all and for all. And I think that's, you know, that's kind of the movement of the idea here is I'm united with everyone else in my failures, perhaps because I have failed to be someone who I'm supposed to be. Other people have also suffered, and this has ripple effects through all time and history. And I don't really have anything to give, but I can offer this sort of acknowledgement that I have nothing to give, and that everything that I do have comes from God, and I'm giving it back. So I don't know. It's kind of complicated, but it's absolutely a Eucharistic idea. I just want to explain a little bit about that, since not everyone may have been aware that that's a liturgical phrase. And I would finally say to watch for this idea playing out through the rest of the book. There will be some similar phrases popping up here and there. See if you see this in action or not. You know, I think, like Melissa said, it's a decent thesis to consider. In the rest of the book, Strains, do we see people acting out the opposite? You know. Taggy, what do you have to say about this?
I'm on board. I really can't add a lot. I think all the points are pretty much there. Like, I think if I would just restate anything, it'd just be like Elder Zosima speaking again. So like, I don't really feel like I have a lot to add, because it's not mind-boggling to me. It's something I just understand to be true. And so it wasn't upsetting. It was just like, yeah, like, duh. I know we've had this conversation before, and like, this was like kind of like maybe a spur to read the book for me. But like, you should read Dostoevsky. Like, you sound like you're talking like Elder Zosima, like you two would get along or something like that. But it's like, yeah, that's totally it. Like, if I would write something down, it would be eloquent. It would sound something like this. Usually it's not, but it's good stuff. I think it's interesting to like to hear the other sides of like people coming into it too. So yeah, I really can't add anything, but that's okay for right now, I think. I haven't fallen asleep yet, so I was like.
I'm sorry, Michael. For some reason, you got reduced to sounds that sounded like a jaw harp for a second. I don't know if everyone else heard him or if that was just my end.
I heard him.
It was just you.
Okay, I think we're having some internet problems at my house, so bear with us if things go out or whatever.
Is it a Jew harp or a jaw harp?
It's both, actually.
Okay.
But one, I don't know.
Never heard a jaw harp before.
Well, it goes in your mouth and your teeth, so.
Yeah. It kind of makes sense either way.
Isn't juice harp the politically correct way of saying it now? No, I'm serious, because that's what we had to do in The Music Man in high school. We had to say juice harp instead.
I do not know the answer to that.
I have no idea.
Let's see.
You busy, bro?
I just wanted to add one last thing, which I keep thinking about, which is this. It's called strains in this translation, and in the first translation I read this in, it was called lacerations, which Normally, I like this translation a lot better. You're right, McGee, but I keep thinking about that idea of laceration, and I don't know Russian enough to say whether like there was some of that tone in whatever word is in Russian too. But I just keep thinking about that too, just because we're gonna start talking. Like strain sounds way less violent than laceration, I think. So I just thought I'd throw that out there.
Yeah, that's an interesting point.
Because these characters are about to go nuts and do some wild stuff.
I want to add one other brief note because I think it's pertinent to this book. It's an idea that's already come up before. We're reading about Father Farapont here in this chapter, and there's some mention of the idea of a holy fool. Holy fool is a kind of particularly strange idea in it's a particularly Russian Orthodox idea. And I assume most of you probably aren't familiar with that, so I just want to explain it for a second. For whatever reason, in the Russian church, this particularly unusual sort of way of pursuing holiness emerged. It's the idea of a holy fool. And the notion was these people who are very close with God, who are receiving some of the gifts of the Holy Spirit, like described in the elders, these insights and miracle workings and healings and stuff, were attempting to conceal their holiness from the world by feigning madness, and in an attempt to fight against pride and not attract too much attention to themselves. So there's this really unusual but solid tradition in Russia of a string of saints who are regarded as holy fools, who say bizarre things and kind of act against the social norm, who are also regarded as having been very close to God and having achieved a high degree of holiness. So we've met a couple characters in this book, and it comes up at different times where that word flies around. So some people say maybe Father Farapont is a holy fool. Stinking Lisaveta was regarded that way in her community. And it also, some of these characters probably are mentally ill, you know, or have some sort of, like Stinking Lisaveta, probably some sort of mental handicap or whatever. But they were still regarded as having the potential to be very holy and saintly in that tradition. So it's a kind of interesting dynamic of the culture that I just thought is worth mentioning. And I think in Father Farapont, it's a good question. Is the guy just totally crazy? Which I think is likely. I think he's probably an example of an abuse of the idea of holy fool, where this is a real weirdo with some wacky and you know, kind of hurtful ideas that's being unfortunately tolerated within that category by the society. So I just thought that was worth commenting on.
I thought it was funny, especially the demons with the tail. That made me laugh.
I like the there's the Holy Spirit and the Holy Spirit. You know, like I don't think this is funny if you haven't spent some time at monasteries.
You also think the mushroom thing is really funny.
That was funny too. It made me think of Tolkien or something.
I mean, if you allow for the metaphysical, you've got to allow for the possibility that people will fake the metaphysical, or be able to, you know, use it for their advantage when they're not tapping into it.
Well, it's kind of funny, like the mushroom part, where it's like everyone thinks like this guy just survives on like one bread. It's like, what the hell do you guys do without mushrooms? Like, you stupid monks. You think I just eat like one loaf of bread a week? It's like I just eat mushrooms all the time.
Well, maybe there's another explanation then. Well, I think like it's an interesting question whether if Father Farapont's ideas are harmful, whether he's faking or whether like there's just this, no one's correcting it, right? They're just like, well, maybe he could be holy, so they're kind of like letting it, I don't know, like maybe he's just got weird ideas, but no one's ever reining him in, or
Well,
I don't know.
He is an example, and I think this is where he really contrasts Elder Zosima. He's an example of the notion that holiness is something that's acquired by a strict and stern effort and a legalistic approach of self-denial, worked through great deeds of fasting. You know, I eat nothing but bread and water and it's a tiny bit, and I stay on my knees all day. You know, this is definitely a major strand within the Christian tradition. And I think Elder Zosima is a nice contrast to that, where his holiness, his gentleness, and his love is not acquired through these kind of self-flagellating physical punishments so that his soul can be free, but it's acquired through a deep insight into his own need for God and his solidarity with everybody else in that kind of desperate brokenness. So I think that's an important point, and maybe one that's not as important to 21st century America, you know, where no one is really considering Father Farapont's path to holiness, you know, but that was certainly, you see his influence on like that Obdorsk monk who's not sure which guy to follow, you know, and he's like, well, my heart feels really confused and messed up after talking to Father Farapont, but he does fast a lot, so he probably is holier, you know?
I mean, I still see that in lots of Christian traditions today in terms of not dancing, holy, and who is not drinking, not gambling, not, you know, it's not about empathy, it's about your nots. And Zosima is talking with, you know, a wealth of empathy for rich women, poor women, else, you know, whoever he meets, he's, you know, trying to empathize.
Yeah, it's not even a question at all for him.
Yeah.
Just like the pure contrast. It's like, well, he doesn't mention fasting at all. He mentions his love and his love for all of humans and how we're all like united as like the same sort of beast. You know. But yeah, it's not about a beast that's fasting or something like that. Like,
It's vipers eating vipers.
Can we say feed the beast, Michael?
feed the beast.
All right. I think we've spent a lot of time on this chapter, and I think that's a nice setup for everything else that happens by contrast. So let's move on. We have an interesting portrait of Alyosha coming back to his father the next day. If you remember from the last book, Fyodor was like, you got to come back tomorrow. You have to promise me you're coming back. And he shows up, and his dad's like,
what the hell are you here?
What's your deal?
What? I know it. Why would you even come here, you idiot? Like, I think we get a pretty interesting portrait of Fyodor again here. Does anyone have any comments on that little section?
You're not an evil man, you're just twisted. That's what I'm hoping for my best case scenario.
I found it pretty interesting that I think in Fyodor's little speech to Alyosha, we have the kind of immediate and direct contradiction of everything that the elder just said in the last chapter. You know, where the elder said, don't hang on to money and, you know, see yourself as a sinner so that you can identify and love everybody. Here is Fyodor stating he's not going to give any money to his own sons, and he needs it all for himself so that he can go on buying women into his 70s or whatever. And like, you know, just like he's planning his whole selfish future. I thought that was a pretty striking contrast. Do you guys have any comments on that?
Well, I just thought it was a really, I don't know, I thought it was very mirthful, but I also thought that when I read it, I just kept thinking how well contrasted, right? I mean, like, I don't know, maybe I'm wrong, but I just kind of almost imagined the writer chuckling to himself, writing Zosima's speech about money, knowing exactly what he's going to have Fyodor say, like, immediately, right? Like, you know what I mean? Like, I almost feel like there's a, I almost feel like it's, I don't know. I feel like there's almost some enjoyable glee in there with the contrast and the paradox.
I don't know if this is as Melissa would say a throwaway comment, but I was enjoyed the universality of the comedy of it. I mean, you can see this like Greek to here to like situational comedies now. You've got this aw shucks protagonist with a good heart, you know, just following direction and then just being shat upon by, you know, an abusive father. Listening to him, like Ivan was in his corner and Fyodor is like talking badly about him. I mean, I found it really amusing. I was chuckling throughout it, just kind of the universality of the irony of the, okay, Dad, I'll come. And no, it's all mine. Also, all your brothers are jerks too.
I think it's particularly ironic here that in his more serious moments of this particular little speech, he you know denies the hope of any sort of future life, and he says, here's the really ironic part. He says, "Your brother Ivan spoke well last night," and I think he's referring there to "There's no God, there's no afterlife. You can kind of do whatever you want." Well, what's particularly ironic about that is that last night Ivan also said, "Viper will eat viper, and I have the right to wish for my own father's death." So the whole worldview that Fyodor has just articulated here pretty much puts him in direct conflict with all his sons, and even with Ivan, who, you know, he's just praising here for articulating the worldview he's currently expressing, but inevitably leads them into conflict. You can't all be self-seeking sensualists and not end up in conflict over money, you know, trying to get the most, embittered relationships between fathers and sons. So I think that's pretty brilliant irony there. And I definitely agree with Micah that I think Dostoevsky was probably laughing as he wrote this.
Can I have a one-line note. Can I make a aside?
Sure.
I was thinking of Mrs. Heron when he referred to "I'll make mud out of him," because Mrs. Heron would always say, "Your name will be mud" in class when she was my teacher.
Wow, I didn't know that. I've never heard that.
Really, she said that constantly.
What did that mean?
You're going to be in trouble.
Your name will be mud.
just to tie it back into for whom we are honoring here.
Right.
And if you're lucky, you'll get an orange.
And a Diet Dr. Pepper diet. Room temperature.
I think for one night we all need to be drinking Diet Dr. Pepper. Maybe the last night in honor of the heron. We just all get some Diet Dr. Pepper and toast it.
Yes, we did actually drink that at his at the overnight vigil while we read the Psalms in front of the casket. So that was honored.
I have it in my fridge right now. I've been buying it.
Oh,
As far as diet sodas go, it's really good.
I disagree, but
well, maybe he drank it chilled, Aaron. That might
oh,
be different.
that would totally change everything.
I'm curious what you guys make of. It's interesting in this chapter. Fyodor actually speaks at length about Ivan and gives his version of what's going on with Ivan. Do you guys remember that? Do you have any comments about that? Here's my take on sort of my summary of Fyodor's read on Ivan. Ivan wants to keep Grushenka from marrying Fyodor so that he has a chance at getting his inheritance, which otherwise would go to Grushenka if Fyodor marries her, and that Ivan is staying with Fyodor in order to win over Katerina. I'm also curious, why do you think Ivan tried to dissuade Fyodor from pressing charges against Dmitri, which he thought about doing for coming in and assaulting him, and evidently Ivan said, convinced him not to. Do you think that these are accurate assessments of Ivan's motives, or is Fyodor just being paranoid because of his money? I don't know the answer to that. I'm curious what you guys think.
I think love and money are both fair hypotheses, but I wasn't sure either. When he was sitting there in the chapter we're going to talk about next, I was pretty sure it at least had something to do with some kind of a conspiratorial love thing. I don't know about the money though.
I thought it was because Ivan wanted to have something to hold over Dmitri, and just in the theme of of all the incidents that have gone on so far, right? Like, if Ivan is the one who can persuade Fyodor not to press charges, right? In some ways, that puts Dmitri in his debt.
I mean, I think that Fyodor has plenty of reason to be somewhat suspicious of Ivan. I'm not sure I totally get his motives. But on the other hand, I do feel like this is another symptom of the same thing we saw kind of with Alyosha, right? Like, where he's like, come back tomorrow. What are you doing here? Like, in one chapter, he's like, oh, Ivan, we get along famously. Like, I love that you're around. And the next, he's like, that jerk, he's spying on me and here to get my money. Like, I think there is a real paranoia about Fyodor, which I think goes to your point, McG. Like, if you're a cheat who's always cheating everyone out of money and trying to get as much money as you can, of course you look at the rest of the world and see violent, sneaky cheats everywhere. I think that's partly why like Alyosha stuns him so much, is because Alyosha really is so honest. I don't think Ivan is that honest, but I do think there's some part of this that's just like Fyodor wildly swinging back and forth like, yeah, I love Ivan. Yeah, he's great. And the next minute, like, no, get out. I hate you. Come home from the monastery. Never mind, you can stay. Like he's just so volatile.
It's worth mentioning that surprising honesty is also why he kept Smerdikov around, who once found, what was it, 200 or 300 ruble bills and just returned them. And he's kind of shocked by that too. The same kind of point you made.
Yeah.
Good one.
I was wondering if maybe the love of Ivan, as well as the suspicion of Ivan, comes from maybe Fyodor seeing a lot of himself in his son. Because, Fyodor is sneaky in his own way. I mean, frequently he's an idiot, so you don't see his ability to be subtle and manipulative, but I think he does have that capacity, because I feel like Ivan gets it from somewhere. So that's the thing. Like, I almost feel like, because when I made that point about, I don't know why I forgot the rest of the point, but I feel like if Ivan had an ulterior motive for wanting Dmitri to be forgiven, I feel like the suspicion from Fyodor may come from he just senses the sense of machination, right? Like, he feels like everything Ivan does is calculated. And if everything he does is calculated, even if it is about love, he's going to naturally be suspicious just because of he feels the nature of the person in front of him.
I love the phrase "sense of machination." Wow, I'm going to use that in a sentence more often.
We have this interesting little passage on 175 at the top where Fyodor is talking about squashing Dmitri like a cockroach. And he'll make a little pop. And he says, you know, Alyosha, you love Mitka. You love him, and I'm not afraid that you love him. But if Ivan loved him, I'd fear for myself because Ivan loved him. Which is a real kind of weird thing to say there. Like, maybe he feels like then he'd have two people going against him. I don't know. But then he makes this interesting comment. But Ivan loves nobody. Ivan is not one of us. People like Ivan are not our people, my friend. They're a puff of dust. The wind blows and the dust is gone. I just think this whole chapter is full of this weird, insightful look at the relationship between Ivan and Fyodor, and it's weird. I can't figure it out exactly.
I like a good onomatopoeia, so the pop is nice. It seems like he's, you know, afraid of all other strategic actors. And I mean, he knows how strategic he is and knows what Dmitri and Ivan are capable of doing. And Alyosha is trying to live the elder Zosima's, you know, message and is just not a threat in that capacity, I don't think.
Yeah, I think that phrase goes to like Alyosha, like being like a neutral party, and he can love whoever he wills, and it's really a non or inconsequential action. But if the two brothers love each other, like then they'll automatically unite against him, and like he can't control them anymore. He can't tie one against the other and kind of play the margins, which is kind of how I see it.
Exactly. I mean, he's able to, you know, play them based on money and based on women, and they're not a united front. He's at least got some play between them.
But I kind of just wonder, like, what's his motive? Like, why does he do this? Like, what does he get into this besides just like
a young kept woman and a lot of rubles?
I guess maybe, but
isn't that everyone's dream?
Power too.
I mean,
yeah.
he reads like everyone's crazy uncle. I mean, sometimes, you know, that's like anarchy and chaos and the joy of causing destruction wherever you go.
There's a lot more I could say about this. I really do find myself fascinated by Fyodor's character, and I think he's a lot more nuanced than people give him credit for. I want to point out one kind of weird and interesting contradiction we had in Over the Cognac in the last book. This kind of funny little passage where Fyodor responds to Smerdykov's talk about how it'd be okay to renounce your faith because it, you know, no one can move mountains and all that stuff. And Fyodor responds like, you know, let you understand that our like, he says this phrase about how kind of like, well, we should believe, but, you know, we're just too busy and too preoccupied with other things, and there's not enough time, you know. So he kind of sort of grudgingly admits that, you know, maybe we should all follow this religion, but yeah, it's too hard. We got other things to do and we're distracted, and that's the main reason we don't believe. And then in this passage on 173, now he's saying, there is no afterlife. I say a man falls asleep and doesn't wake up, and that's all. You know, Ivan spoke well yesterday. It's interesting. Fyodor seems to constantly change his mind, change his position, or represent it differently to different people. It's really hard to pin him down. I'm not sure he knows what he actually thinks. Also, he seems to be particularly like criticizing Ivan and maybe saying that he's putting on a front. He has this passage at the bottom of that paragraph. Ivan's a braggart. He doesn't have so much learning or any special education either. He's silent, and he grins at you silently. That's how he gets by. I do agree with all of you that like he seems to be super suspicious. Like this guy's up to something, but it seems like he thinks he has some special insight. And I wonder if that's because, like Mike has stated, he thinks they have something in common. You know, are Ivan and Fyodor somehow they share a similar worldview, you know, even though they express themselves so differently.
I would struggle to put my my finger on what that is, other than like strategic.
Strategery.
Yeah, or trying to be strategic. I mean, you know, McGee said, you know, it's like with the play acting thing is essentially what McGee was emphasizing, is that Fyodor can be and express very different things to everyone else at different times. It's either he's neurotic and has no values, or else he's, you know, being strategic in every situation.
All right, let's move on to the.
I killed it. I killed the conversation.
No, I think actually, I just became aware we've talked about 2 chapters, and we're an hour into the conversation here. So,
I love you people.
I want to invite us to move on to
the funniest
Alyosha's
chapter 10, the funniest chapter name in all of the book. He gets involved with schoolboys.
Thank you, Aaron. I'm not sure if there's a lot to say about that chapter, if anyone wants to. I kind of want to move towards the at the Koklakovs and the interactions with Lise and Katerina. So if anyone has anything to say about he gets involved with the schoolboys, chime in on that before I move on.
I think anything I would have to say about it, I would wait and say when we're talking about him meeting the whole family at the cottage. So,
this was like the second time in the book verbs were used, like something external happened, and it wasn't just a reflection on the soul or a dialogue. Also, reflection of Alyosha again. But.
Yeah, so we'll talk a little bit about Alyosha later. I think this is one of the sections of the book where he's had a chance to do more things, and we haven't spent much time talking about Alyosha, so I do want to do that. But let's first move on to the Koklakovs. I have to say, Madame Koklakov is one of my absolute favorite characters. I find her hilarious, and very relatable. She can't finish a sentence. Her thoughts are everywhere. She's just sort of this busybody, fussy lady that's, I think everybody knows this lady from somewhere, you know? I just find her very entertaining. It's interesting. The first chapter here is really more about Alyosha and Lise and this letter that she sent to him declaring her love. So I want to invite comments about Lise for a minute.
Now he gets involved with the schoolgirls.
Thank you again, Aaron.
I'm sorry, I'll stop talking.
I know that you bring your bear for the purpose of entertainment. I'm glad I have mine just so that I can be comforted after these comments. hurt me talking about my poor Alyosha so horribly.
Sorry.
That's okay. Well,
I mean, obviously she is young. That was discussed a little bit last week, I think. But she very obviously feels something for him, but tries to cover it up by saying, "Oh, I was just joking. Oh, I was just joking. Oh, I'm so embarrassed. Oh, I'm so horrible. Oh, I'm so whatever." And I feel like that's relatable. I mean, not so much me now, but let's say maybe 14-year-old me. It just, I don't know, it seems very real.
Yeah, and I think there's something that she shares in common with the plight of several other characters who are kind of, I mean, she's crippled and ill and in a chair and has to be wheeled around, and she has this kind of crazy mother who's overbearing, and she clearly reflects some of that same hysterical drama in in herself, but I do see her as a bit of this character coming from a place of extreme humiliation, who doesn't have a voice or a way to say things, and maybe has, this isn't the right way of putting it all, something to prove, but I think we see several characters who are kind of stretched to their limits of humiliation, acting in desperation in these chapters. And I just thought that's, maybe she's an interesting parallel in that, as this sort of sidelined, ill girl who no one takes seriously,
Well, I'm really glad you made that connection, because I had not thought about that. And to me, it circles back to some of what we were saying with Zosima, but also immediately made me think of that line. I'm glad you said it after bringing up all these points about Fyodor, because to be honest, I didn't care that much about Fyodor in this chapter, and you helped me to care about him more, because I was thinking back to when Zosima said to him, like, most of all, don't be so ashamed of yourself, right? That's where all this trouble comes from. And I feel like that could be another thesis for this chapter, is that all of these characters have like an opportunity where they could be humiliated. Like, really, I think it's not to understate it, by social standards, any of them would be humiliated by their actions, but they also have the opportunity to be really genuine, right? To like share their heart honestly, and then potentially have something happy happen to them, and they all choose to retreat. And as Ginny said, I think that's very relatable, right? Like when you put your heart out on the line about something, and then you're like, oh, never mind. I still do this all the time. You're married to me, I'm just like, hey, do you want to do this? No, never mind. I meant like, maybe just like I needed to get a snack. I'll go over here. Like, I feel like I think Dostoevsky really captures this moment about how it really is socially beaten into us in so many different cultures not to put ourselves out there in a way, right? Like not to be vulnerable. And all the things these characters are doing are humiliating. Like, I don't know romantic conventions, but I guess like a young girl writing a note to a monastery novice confessing love's not really socially acceptable. Like, Katerina following Dmitri around, even though he's taken up with a kept woman, not going to be socially acceptable. But also her throwing him over to be with his brother wouldn't be socially acceptable. Like, and then we'll get to, I never know how to say his name. The Snigilov, help me, Russian speaker.
Snegiryov.
What he said, like accepting the money, right? Like, I feel like all of them have these moments where they have a chance to put their heart and say what they really need or want, and then they backtrack. And I think Fyodor is a buffoon and takes this to an extreme, but we see that all of us have some strain of that. We try to play it off and put on an act in order to protect ourselves.
I think that's totally true. And I also think when I tried to say it was only 14-year-old me, I don't giggle the same, but No, you always told me now. You know what I mean? Like, yeah, as Melissa said, like things like that, and things where you kind of try and backtrack or are ashamed of something, or I don't know, pretend like it was something else. That's completely it. And I think it's interesting to think now about I'm just now putting together from what Melissa said about shame with our conversation, you know, a half hour ago or whatever about guilt.
Mm-hmm.
And how those two relate and parallel in this. Like it's, you know, guilt is more as it relates to, I guess, things that are considered sinful or, you know, morally wrong or wrong according to God. And then shame may be looking at things that are wrong according to societal norms.
I think that's a good definition of the distinction, because the way, and I think this would be similar, because the way, because I made a note when I was reading this about, because it comes back to, you know, what he said about don't be ashamed so much. There's a Western, there's kind of a Western equivalent. I mean, I'm sure there are more than one, but I don't know if you've ever heard of Philip Neri. He's a Western saint, but he's kind of like one of those similar to like the Fools. And one of the things he writes about is about the difference between guilt and shame, and why like the church fathers will say guilt good, shame bad. Is shame is essentially the fear of not being loved and accepted. It's not so much about an act as much as it's about one's relation. Like, so if one is ashamed, like when Adam and Eve hide from God in the garden, it's because they're afraid of what God will do to them. It's not so much about the act, it's about they no longer conceive of themselves as lovable. And I think that it's really important to understand that even with guilt, like even with talking about guilt and like being guilty, the idea, I think that the formal distinction like between Zosima and talking about being guilty of the world, it's entirely like about Eucharistic, right? Like in Eucharistic guilt, if you wanted to call it that, you're still confident in the love of God, and you're still confident in your ability to be loved as a human being. And shame is where that falls apart.
Well, I would take it to shame is actually a function of pride, and guilt is like a neutral action. I wrote a big journal entry on this actually. It's about 6 pages long. It's long and quite developed, but yeah,
Highlights
it's like
might be nice.
What's that?
Could you tell me why there's a difference?
Why is there a difference between shame and guilt? Well, guilt would just be like the action creates a guilt. It's a position. It's totally just positional, right? So it's like it's where you are. You are guilty, right? It's where you stand. Shame is your reaction to that. So you have two options to react to guilt. One is shame, and that is accepting your pride. You're not able to humble yourself or act in humility, and the other option is humility or asking for forgiveness. And so like those are the two things. So shame is obviously bad, and humility would be the other one. So which would be good. So that's kind of the gist, the Cliff Notes.
I'd like to underscore the statement of Lise that probably encapsulates her shame best, which is page 184 near the top. Alyosha is trying to explain why he received her letter favorably and maybe is on board with this idea. Like, yeah, maybe I'd marry you. And she's giving all her objections to that now. So she says, but I'm a freak. I'm driven around in a wheelchair. Lisa laughed, a blush coming to her cheeks, and he says, I'll wheel you around myself. I'm sure you'll be well by then. And then she goes on to, she's still kind of trying to backtrack from her ardent confession the other day. That one I think encapsulates the shame. Like, I'm a freak. Like, how could anyone love me? I'm in a wheelchair. You know, I basically consider myself unlovable, and I probably should have never said what I said yesterday because I was, now I've taken a risk of being crushed,
Brene Brown sums it up very succinctly. Guilt is I did something wrong. Shame is I am something wrong, right? And so she talks about how when we have guilt, when we say I did something wrong, we can change our behavior, we can reconcile. If we believe we are wrong, we can turn into Lise or Fiat or you know what I mean? Like we do destructive things, we hide ourselves, we spin out of control. So that was something I read when I was reading her work that has stuck with me for a long time.
I dig the Brene Brown reference. It's awesome.
Thank you.
That is a really clear and succinct articulation of that idea. I think that kind of like illuminates it perfectly. I want to highlight one of the again, there's so much humor in this book. That's part of the reason I love it. Madame Koklakov is one of the funniest characters, and this is one of my absolute favorite moments in the book. Alyosha's had his finger bitten, and they've been like fussing over that, right? And their kind of private moment is now interrupted because Mama is back in the room, and Lisa is now kind of she's sort of playfully accepting this idea that maybe someone does love me, and she starts sort of hinting at Alyosha wants to get married. Can you believe that? This monk wants to get married. Imagine him married. Isn't it funny? Isn't it terrible? And Lisa kept laughing her nervous little laugh, looking coyly at Alyosha. Madame Koklakov says, "Why married, Lisa? Why this all of a sudden? And why are you all of a sudden? Besides, that boy may be rabid." "Oh, Mama, can there be rabid boys?" "Why can't there be, Lise? As if I would say something silly. Your boy might have been bitten by a rabid dog and become a rabid boy, and then he might go and bite someone around him." That's hilarious.
I thought you were going to bring up the point where she's like, "Lise, stop screaming." Oh, wait, it is I that is screaming. Like you died laughing at that part.
I just love the back and forth between I'm hysterical, but you're going to make me hysterical. I love that whole dynamic. All right, so let's move on to the real beefy stuff here.
After an hour and a half, we're getting to the beefy stuff.
Yeah. So we have strain in the drawing room. Here's the real kind of sudden illuminating insight into Ivan. What is going on with this guy? Katerina, this sort of mysterious, proud figure. All of a sudden, we're really getting this inside view of them. Yeah. So I'm curious. We have, well, I'll just open up a general comment on what's going on in the drawing room. I have some questions to ask, but maybe I don't want to start with that. So, anything leap out at you in these chapters?
I'm switching the laundry, but I took my headphones off. I can hear.
Does that mean we get to hear Aaron's question?
Well, I had one question jumped out at me in this chapter. So in this chapter, I think is when Ivan finally does admit that, yes, I am in love with Katerina. So, we have that piece answered. He does love her, but then he goes on to say, but she doesn't love me back. And I am not entirely convinced of Katerina's feelings toward Ivan.
Yes. All right. I'll go ahead and ask my question.
I would like to discuss that.
All right. Let me phrase that question. We actually get 3 different perspectives on other people's reads of Katerina. So everyone is trying to figure out what's going on with Katerina. We have Madame Koklakov, who's like, "Thank God, Alyosha, you've come." There's this strain going on in there. She loves him and she's pushing him away, and they're both convincing themselves this is a good idea, and it's just madness. So that's her take on it. Alyosha shows up and makes his own assessment, which he then deeply regrets because it causes this big scene, and he blames himself for it. And then we have Ivan in his sort of moment of passion, giving his read on Katerina, which is like, you know, she actually doesn't love Dmitri or me, and she's been tormenting me the whole time. So who's right? Is anybody right? You know, whose read on Katerina is right? What is your read on Katerina? I would like to know. Did you hear that, Aaron?
I heard all of it. Had to read it. She's a playa. I was I've been focusing a lot on Alyosha's development, so this is on the side, but I like how he's trying to help the poor bullied boy. He's trying to help his dad. He's going around, and then it just seems like, all right, I'm supposed to go out in the world, and then he's like, okay, you idiots, this is what's clearly going on. And he actually like engages with people in a and probably a constructive but a non like monk aesthetic sort of a way. I enjoyed it when he kind of blew up at them. But I don't know what Katerina wants. It seems like perhaps she is into duty and into being with Dmitri for that reason. Maybe she loves Ivan, but you know, she might just like the ordeal. Some people like the ordeal.
I have to agree with Aaron on that one, because no matter, I feel like there's an authentic pull in her for Dmitri, and there's an authentic pull in her for Ivan, but what she likes most of all is her pride. And so it's hard to get a central read on Katerina, because when her pride is the central thing of her character, it's kind of hard to say who do you love most when that's not really the central factor, as much as I think what Aaron just said about the ordeal.
The answer to that question is her. She loves herself most, but who does she actually love? Like in this question, I don't know. I'm not quite sure.
We get this absolutely scathing, ironic rebuke from Ivan on page 190 when he's agreeing with her whole plan to go and be with Dmitri. Yes, Ivan interrupted with the sudden passion, clearly angry he'd been interrupted. Yes, in another woman, this moment would be only yesterday's impression and no more than a moment. But with Katerina Ivanovna's character, this moment will last all her life. What for others would just be a promise, for her is an everlasting, heavy, perhaps grim, but unfailing duty, and she will be nourished by this feeling of fulfilled duty. Your life, Katerina Ivanovna, will now be spent in suffering, contemplating your own feelings and your own high deed and your own grief. But later the suffering will mellow, and your life will then turn into the sweet contemplation of a firm and proud design, fulfilled once and for all, truly proud in its own way, and desperate in any case, but which you have carried through. And this awareness will finally bring you the most complete satisfaction and will reconcile you to all the rest. And, you know, after he goes on later to explain that he feels like she's been taking out her revenge for how Dmitri has mistreated her by sort of pushing away Ivan when she knows that he loves her. This whole thing sounds like his sort of his own sort of malicious revenge is like, you don't love me, go ahead and have your dream and torture yourself for the rest of your life like you want to, you know. I hope you burn while you do it.
Hey, is my mic working yet?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Because I think that what I was trying to say was like, I think that nobody has fully gotten all of Katerina. And I think we all, as readers, in my experience, years of teaching this book, have a tendency to be really hard on her. But I think she's being drawn as a direct parallel to the guy whose name I can't say. Snigiryev.
Sniggers.
Yeah, I
Just
can't
call him
say. I
Sniggy.
can't say.
Just call him
Sniggy.
Sniggy.
The Westbrook rapper from the 90s.
I'm just saying, in my experience, and I know it's jumping ahead, but I can't talk about them separately. Like, in my experience, people tend to be very sympathetic on him being so proud that he won't take Katerina's money. But they're like really harsh on Katerina for being so proud that she doesn't want to give up on Dmitri. And I just always kind of end up wanting to kind of like, clearly she's acting out of pride, but I don't think she's the most proud character more than anyone else in this section. Like, so many of these characters are being selfishly motivated to protect their feelings out of pride. And I just think of her as like, her fiance is running around with a hooker, like, or not a hooker, whatever, a kept woman. I'm just like, her fiance is flaunting in her face, running around. And is it stupid to stay in that relationship? Yes, but like, also just, she's so wounded. And I think it's possible to like simultaneously say she's making a terrible choice, but then to try and have some sympathy the way we often do for Snigiryev, right, is like, she's just trying to hold on to some scrap of dignity when her whole engagement, she's been twice humiliated her company, and then he's throwing her engagement in her face. Like, she's clearly making stupid decisions, but she's clearly really deeply hurt and wounded and trying to salvage some dignity out of the situation. And I think, again, there's the parallel because we see her taking her revenge out on Ivan, and Snigiryev is going to take his revenge against Dmitri out on Alyosha, right? Like, we see these parallels of Dmitri's running amok, hurting people, their pride gets wounded, they end up making terrible decisions and lashing out, which is where I do feel like that idea of like laceration can be helpful. It's like, just lash out to cut or hurt anyone that's near you to displace some of the pain, right? And doing stupid things. But to me, that's also very relatable. Yeah.
This, it just occurred to me, maybe a good example of how that idea that I'm responsible or guilty for all on behalf of all actually plays out. So, you know, you have several characters making really unfortunate decisions at which the root is ultimately Dmitri and his, you know, kind of careless indulgence of his passions or whatever, having ripple effects through other characters that's ruining other people's lives indirectly, you know.
And I think Ivan's being kind of a weirdo in this situation too, right? Like, he doesn't just come out and say, no, I really love you. He's been like playing this game for weeks. And now he's like, yes, I love you, but I will sarcastically tell you in this real strange way. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that, not to get ahead of it, but the only reason why I don't have a lot more sympathy for Ivan later in the book is because of this moment. Because I feel like this is him at his most sadistic. And I really, and I know it's because he's also hurt, but, and then that's the thing. But at the same time, this is the moment where you really can see him being a son of a bitch. And also just the idea, I think I love what McGee just said about root causes. And, you know, when we said, well, how would Theodore see himself in common with Ivan? I think it's just, maybe it's just a more universal human thing. He knows them because of their blood, their universal humanity, their tendency to hurt because they've been hurt. Right, and then that gets down to the why you have to be accountable for the guilt of all is just to forsake one's pride, just to stop the cycle of hurting out of pride. You know, like, you just have to own up to all of it and accept responsibility for all of it, because otherwise the cycle of mutual wounding never stops.
Well, it's kind of interesting in this section that Dmitri is not even like a character here. Like, he's not actually, but like, the whole conversation is almost like surrounding him, like exactly what McGarvey said. Like, all of this is based on Dimitri's actions, and like, it's all kind of rippling through all these characters, and it's far removed. Like, you've got Sniggy that's like way out there, and like it's like crazy, like how it's all actually connected, but it's like, you know, 6 or 7 steps removed, like, but kind of crazy. Like, and like, if that's the common theme that's like kind of put out there, I think this is genius. I mean,
Sniggy, you mean old Wisp-Broom?
yes.
I do like how Ivan is kind of being prideful in that most horrific way. Micah was referring to it, like when you're in relatable, like when you're in a breakup and you feign being nice but say the most hurtful things, the most sadistic things. That resonated with me a lot. I mean, that's, oh yeah, great, you're wonderful, go on, and also I hope you suffer forever. See ya.
Yeah, but isn't that how everybody feels when somebody breaks your heart?
Yeah, that's why it resonates so much, because I've done that like 79 times.
I have a very hard time condemning Yvonne here. I think this is one of the few moments where he actually shows his heart, which is a rare occurrence, and particularly his second. So the first one is vicious, where he's like, yes, you'll go on to have this future of fulfilled duty where you destroy yourself. But his second passage, where he talks about she kept me near for constant revenge. He talks about this is all coming out of an insult that started at her first meeting with Dmitri, and how much he loved her, and she knew it, but she's been intentionally tormenting him. I find that all very, I don't know what the right word is. It's a refreshing honesty and authenticity from Yvonne, who's not playing a game in this moment, but actually telling you straight up his heart. I find that to be one of the most relatable moments of Yvonne, where it's like the walls come down and you get to see what's actually been going on inside.
I think he's being honest, but I also think he's seeing Katerina through his own pain. My read on this, I don't think she's been deliberately playing a game with them. Like, my read of her, honestly, is she doesn't know what she wants, right? Like, she's torn between a sense of I should do the noble thing and feeling this connection to Yvonne. I don't know. Like, to me in that moment, I'm like, oh, Yvonne, I don't think Katerina like has a revenge board where she's plotted all of this out. Like, to me, that's where he sounds just wounded. And like, her anger in multiple scenes to me is relatable because she seems shocked that everyone thinks this. I'm not sure she knows that she's in love with Yvonne. Like, I think that is an entirely possible read, is she really is just trying to be noble. And sure, she's too proud, but I don't think she's like sitting in her room at night like, yes, now I shall say something mean to Yvonne and continue to humiliate. I think she really thinks she's in love with Dmitri, and it's stupid and misguided, and she's deluding herself. But I don't think she's like vicious. I think that's him being like his dad, like seeing malice where there isn't necessarily any. There's just a misguided other person throwing themselves around trying to be a big noble person.
That may be so, but I personally think Yvonne's read is closest, and he is speaking from a wound here. But when he says she doesn't really love me or him, I think that's right. Like, I don't think she loves Dmitri or Yvonne. I'm not sure. Definitely, maybe she hasn't made up her mind. I certainly don't think she loves Dmitri.
Maybe she doesn't love him in whatever way we would define it or judge it to be a love that would be worth anything, but she at least has an obsession. I mean, she has strong emotions towards Dmitri, whether or not they're love. And I think this is another one of those cases, because I didn't want to interrupt like the last three people. I have several things all fighting in my brain to be said right now. One, I definitely agree with whoever said, I think this page like 192, 193 is the most open Ivan has ever been about his own feelings. I think he is being very truthful, very open. Whether or not his read of Katerina is correct, I don't know, but I think when he's speaking about himself, he's being very open and honest. And I think also Katerina, I totally agree, she doesn't know what she wants. Like, and I think that's why I started, when we started talking about this chapter, I said I felt like I got a good read on Ivan, because I felt in this moment he was open and honest. I still have no clue about Katerina. And the more we talk about it, the more I think that's because she doesn't know. And I think that whatever her feelings toward Dmitri, they are expressing themselves in like this super unhealthy way that just makes me cringe. Like the whole, she's describing like, I'm gonna follow him his whole life, but I'm not gonna get in his face. I'm just gonna be there, and I'm just gonna, like, that is such a trap. I think we talked last week about her wanting to be like this savior for him, and it's just such this unhealthy trap that it makes me cringe.
I almost wonder if is Ivan doing the same thing for her too, like trying to rescue her from Dmitri at the same time that she's trying to rescue Dmitri.
Oh,
Interesting.
Well, I just wanted to say, like, that same passage you started reading from McG, Yvonne actually goes on to say, like, in the middle of that long second speech, Katerina Ivanovna, you indeed love only him, Dmitri, and the more he insults you, the more you love him. That is your strain. So they actually use that word. You precisely love him as he is. You love him insulting you. If he reformed, you would drop him at once and stop loving him altogether. But you need him in order to continually contemplate your high deed of faithfulness and to reproach him for his unfaithfulness. And it all comes from your pride. And I guess, like, to me, I feel like this conversation is hard because how do you talk about its relatability without getting into your whole own life? But like, there is something really relatable. And whenever I was teaching this, it comes up, like, there's a gender role thing to this about women. And, you know, people are always like, why do women fall in love with bad men? Because, and this came up last week, there's this whole narrative about how it's our job to save them and be somebody's doormat. And that if you're in that kind of miserable relationship, it's a good thing, right? So I'm just saying, like, I often say that it can be hard to see Katerina's point of view because that's a narrative that as 21st century women, we've been told to reject, but is still in our culture in such a deep way that it's scary. And like seeing a character actually voice it is like, run. But then some people are like, yeah. And not just women, men and women are like, yeah, but I've seen these dynamics play out in so many relationships. And I think, like, I live Taggy's point, like, it can go both ways too. Like, these hero narratives about people trying to save each other. I don't know. I think that to me is where it's like, I'm not sure she has like some evil plan. I do think she wants to just be a hero, but I'm not sure she's like sat and thought that all out. I think it's a really prescient reading of her. But like, dang, I've had that moment where you're like, oh crap, like I've been doing something and I didn't even know my motives. And I think that's partly what's going on with Katerina is she really thinks she's being noble, but it turns out she just like because she was humiliated. It goes back to the shame thing. Somehow she feels like if she rescues this man who humiliated her, then she won't be humiliated anymore. So she's going to stay until that can be undone. Like, she's got to have the upper hand. If she was just going to be like, fine, go be with Grushenka, I'll go be happy. It's like he won somehow, which is so twisted and yet makes so much sense to me.
I saw so many people nodding during that. I enjoyed watching all the reactions to that comment.
I was so trying to be silent and still be like, yes, yes, yes.
I just mean, I've had girls try and do that to me, and I've tried to do that to girls. I mean, it's a ubiquitous experience, I think. And at best, it's people love the chaos and love the drama, and
and hate it at the same time, right?
Yeah, and at worst, you're flagellating yourself. Because you don't think you're worthy of a healthy relationship and somebody who treats you with respect.
Mm-hmm.
I think this links to Ferapont too. And the reason why is because the priest who I felt I knew was like Ferapont, we called him Father Savonarola. He was a guy who, when he asked a friend of mine who's from Slovakia if his parents were faithful Catholics during the persecution, and when he said, well, my uncle was imprisoned and they broke all the fingers in his hand, and then he literally took the guy's hands and went, good, and it was one of those moments where, like, my friend had to like show his own grace to not like want to punch this Dominican in the face. But the thing is, right, is like, it's not just the culture, it's also, I feel like that religious affect of Ferapont would also tell Katerina, good, suffer, this is the noble thing, suffering like this is the noble thing. And I feel like in a certain way, like the Ferapont and Zosima, like, I feel like the dynamic of that, I feel like it's also present here in the sense of what is the prideful like this idea of being a hero and what it's actually doing to you, and suffering as heroic and what it's actually doing to you in terms of your humanity. I feel like those two, that strain and those veins of thought, I think, go together.
Guys, this has been awesome. I'm so glad you shared all that. I have to say, like, I would love to hear more of your thoughts as the novel progresses on Ivan and Katerina in particular and their motivations. And I have read this book multiple times, and I find Katerina to be the most mysterious character and hardest for me to understand. And maybe that's because I'm a guy. But I really would like to hear your impressions of what she's up to and why as we move forward. And I've really enjoyed talking about this chapter with you. I also
started laughing because I think Ivan and Katerina are the two characters that I get the most. So yeah.
But their motives are the most hidden. You know, you have to dig to find them. They don't declare them openly by any means. So I also just have to say, I find it pretty amusing how we have this big strain that happens and this big fallout, and Madame Koklikov is so pleased by this. She's like, this is exactly what we needed. You've been an angel, Alyosha. You've been an angel. I knew this is what you would help to accomplish. Because she's convinced that they do love each other, and you know, you just need to bring that fight up so that, you know, they can get to the truth, I guess. So I find her to be very amusing and a great comic relief as all this drama goes down.
Well, she's basically staging her own rom-com, right? You know, they love each other. Let's put them in a room. Maybe they'll fight enough that eventually they'll just start making out. Because isn't that how it goes?
That's so right. Like, she knows the ending,
there's
and
a
she's
monk
gonna
there, right? Like, for...
All right, so we've got one more strain to go, and strain in the cottage and in the fresh air. I think these chapters with Snegiryov are some of the most poignant, insightful, and really sad chapters in the book. I'm really looking forward to discussing these with you guys. You know, here's the guy, the whisk broom that's been humiliated by Dmitri, and again, thinking about those ripple effects. You know, think about his son, Ilyusha. There's some very poignant comments that Captain Snegiryov explains about what his son went through in this whole ordeal, and how he was suddenly hit with the hard truth of the rich are the most powerful people on earth. You know, and he went through all this inside his little heart. It leads to his fight with the other boys. He gets hit with a rock. He's already been weak. Now he's ill. Like, we can really see those ripples expanding out very far. Let's talk about the person of Captain Snegiryov a little bit. He's kind of a tragic character. And clearly another one of Fyodor's humiliated characters. What are your impressions of Captain Snegiryov and what he goes through in these chapters?
Well, I think this is another one that when it came to the very end of it, you know, the last page of the reading, the book chapter was, I didn't get it. I felt like I got to the last page and I missed something, because Alyosha was doing what Katerina had said. She had said, you're the only person who could convince him to actually take this money. You have to convince him. And it sounded like he was. And they were getting really, you know, maybe I could accept this money. Maybe we could actually do these things. We could actually do these things. And then somehow, I don't know, did Alyosha just get too excited and cross a line somewhere? Because all of a sudden he took it all back and ran away. And then that was the end of the chapter.
So yeah, you've taken us straight to the climactic point here, and that's fine. Let's talk about that moment. You know, we have this great buildup of it might be working. I think he's going to take the money. He thinks about all the wonderful things he could do with that money, and then a change comes over him. So it sounds like you were surprised by that change, Ginny. Is that right? Like you didn't see, you're like, where is this coming from? What are the rest of your reactions to that moment?
Well, even though it's not my first reading, I was surprised how involved I was getting into it when I was reading it, because I know it's about to happen.
Mm-hmm.
And yet there was a huge part of me that just still wanted him to take it.
Mm-hmm.
Like I was still like, just take it. Just maybe I found a new edition where he takes it, right? I know that's dumb, but
No, I had the same reaction. It's like when you're watching the action movie again, you're like, no, every time you go to the door, you get hurt, you know? Like, it's that same feeling.
maybe this is the secret Titanic where Leo gets rescued, but
Room
I still find it crushing and heartbreaking when he doesn't take the money.
But I feel like the reason why he doesn't, I feel like there was something in Alyosha when he got excited, like, because you know there's that line from Alyosha, I too am a Karamazov. I feel like there was something when Alyosha felt like he was going to accept it, where Alyosha was just unguardedly happy. And I always felt like in that moment there was something in either his appearance or in his gestures or in his voice or something that all of a sudden reminded, you know, I'm not going to try to say his name, but I think it feel in some ways he was just reminded of the Karamazovs.
Sticky.
I feel like there's just something where all of a sudden he saw that little bit of Dmitri. And that was always just how I read it. Like something happened there where he felt like he was giving a Dmitri a win by saying yes, and that was the thing he could not allow.
I think that's insightful. I was reading it more as the literary device where like old Sniggy there was talking like 1800s prospector, like, oh, we're gonna get to California and everything's gonna be great. I was like, no, he's not gonna take it. There's no way.
No, I disagree with that reading. I think he had every intention of taking it up until the last moment, you know, that he had seen, okay, this is from this lady who's been offended like I have been, and he starts dreaming about everything he could do with it. But I do think Mike is onto something here with the sort of unrestrained joy that Alyosha displays. You know, Katerina Ivanovna will send you more if you need more. You have as much as you want. I even have money. I'll give you some money. You know, like you can have that happy future. I think all of a sudden what he's reminded of is his position of humiliation, of his position at the bottom of society where, yes, he can have this dream, but it will mean he's dependent on someone else. And I don't think it necessarily has to do with Dmitri. I think it has to do with his wounded honor, his sense that he's been dishonored, his sense of before his son that he's looking bad. He couldn't defend his honor by challenging to a duel. And now by taking this, he essentially becomes a beggar, you know? And I think that's the thing for him. It's that sense of now I had to depend on someone else. In this one twisted moment, he has a chance to somehow reclaim some lost honor by absolutely trouncing on a gift from someone else. And that stamping on it and regaining his honor is somehow more valuable and more important to him than everything else in that moment. And he destroys his future to redeem his honor because he sees an opportunity somehow to basically give the finger to, you know, to everybody else, and especially Dmitri, even though this isn't really from him. So that's my take on that.
And that's where I see such a clear parallel with Katerina, right? Where she's like, it's not letting someone else decide for you. It's somehow feeling like you need to maintain agency and control of the situation, right? So Katerina's version is saying, oh, if Dimitri's going to throw me over, no, he won't. I'll follow him to the ends of the earth, right? Like it's this weird, twisted way where you actually lose power and are in a terrible situation, but by doing so, you retain the choice. And I feel like the special irony here is I think of all the things Katerina has done, this is one that I actually feel like is pretty just open-hearted, right? It's not, I think in this case, her trying to be a good person. I really think she's like, oh, he was insulted, I was insulted, I have all this money, I'll give him some money. So for once, she isn't trying to do it to be some like great noble lady like everything with Dimitri is. But then I don't know, to me, that's where I so clearly see both of them being like, and I think this is a theme that will come up. And that I think is especially hard for American audiences because for us, everything is about agency and choice and our own will. And like, I feel like we get that, right? We wouldn't want somebody to just give us money if it meant we were humiliated. We want to have choice and pride. And I think both of these characters are saying, yes, that's more important than happiness. I would rather stamp on your money, stamp on your love, as long as I get to say what my life is. I get to build my own life.
I think this is one of the deepest psychological insights in the whole novel. Like you could have your whole future that you dream of, and you're going to crush that in a moment, unexpectedly at the last moment, because of this need to kind of push someone away because you're hurt, you know? And I'm actually reminded of one of the most powerful moments I had when I was in seminary. We were going and doing hospital chaplaincy visits and kind of being trained on how to listen to people in suffering when they're ill and when they're in the hospital and stuff. And I remember very clearly this moment of the kind of veteran chaplain lady that was there talking to us about how when we go into the room, our mission is not to make someone better or to make them feel better, or like that we're there to listen and to be present in whatever way they need. And she made this special point that was kind of mind-blowing to me. It's just like, sometimes people are going to hate you for going in and talk to them, and they're going to throw you out of the room. And sometimes they just need someone that they can throw out of the room, you know, and that's your job today, is to be the person that goes in there and gets yelled at and thrown out of the room, you know, because they're so out of control of everything else in their life that they had to have one person they could say no to, go away, you know. And I think that's kind of what's going on here, is this man in a desperate situation who has been trod upon by the world and humiliated by everyone. And he has one moment he can seize on where he has power over someone else to assert his dignity and honor. And so he trounces on the bills, you know, and throws Alyosha out of the room.
Yeah, I agree with you.
No, I think that makes a lot of sense. I was actually drawing a parallel when you were talking about that to, who was it? Was it Madame Koklikov, like a couple weeks ago, saying how she wanted to go do all these good things, but then she wouldn't if they didn't say thank you?
Yeah, right. Yeah, well, that's a great point, because yeah, here's a guy who's not going to thank you, you know?
Yeah.
It's interesting because that point about Madame Koklikov, I told my friend who's a Catholic priest, I was, you know, doing the Brothers K reading group, and he actually told me, he said, I can't give you specifics, but that line from Madame, and then he said the name in a different pronunciation, about how I'd be a saint if people would only appreciate me. Like, I have never gone a week of my priesthood without having at least 2 people tell me that. So thank you for bringing that up so I could then share that with you.
Hey.
Well, and I think just this is where I think it circles back to the opening speech by Father Zosima too, where he's talking about how one of the most important things is not to be proud. And I think that's something we hear so often if we are going to church, like if we're in the Christian world, that we kind of become numb to it, how hard it actually is not to be proud, right? Because I just think, like, I'm just going to talk personally for a little bit and circle back. Like the past 3 years, I've had 3 separate situations where I've actually been dependent on, well, 4 now, because we've lived in Aaron's house too. I've had 4 situations where I've had to go and live in someone's house. And one of the reasons we went to, like, we were so excited to stay with Aaron, because when you're with friends, it doesn't feel the same way. But like when I was actually utterly dependent on people, like I didn't have housing, I had nowhere to go without them, I fully realized how proud I was, right? Like, I don't think of myself as a proud person, but it was so hard, like, to spend time living in someone's house. Like, you have nothing to offer them, right? Except like, hi, you care about me in some way. So like, I'm talking about when I lived with people from church, that they're just putting me up out of the goodness of their heart. I know they're doing it because they're Christians and they believe this is important, but still, like, it sucks. And I felt like I actually have had a lot of gratitude, because most of my life I haven't been in a position to be literally monetarily dependent on someone other than my parents, right? I haven't had to do that. And being forced by multiple disasters into that situation really made me, I think, have more empathy for characters like this. Because at first you're just like, for me, it's like, I kind of get it, but just take the money. But now I see sort of that, like, this idea, this Christian idea of not being proud is actually really, really hard, because so much of what societies say is valuable about us is pride, right? Being able to take care of yourself, being able to make choices. So anyway, I don't know, maybe that was just off topic, but to me, I feel like this is actually, so many of Zosima's ideas just sound like nice, like cross stitch it on a pillow, but they're really radical and difficult, right? Not being proud could make so many of these characters happy, but they like, not being proud is a battle, like having to fight this tendency to, I don't know, I think I get this impulse to throw money on the ground and throw Yvonne out of the house and just be like, I get that moment of like, I will assert my will even if it destroys everything. And I guess I've had to see that part of myself more, where it's like, for me, it's more the form of, I won't ask for help, I'll just wither away and die quietly over here. And how stupid that is. I don't know. Rambling again, but maybe with a point.
I think it's completely to the point, because like what you just talked about, the experience of being a house guest is actually foreshadowing a really important illusion later in the novel. Because we remember, and I don't want to get far ahead of people who haven't read it, but remember about the person who represents the person who always has to be a house guest. And like that conversation and the nature of that, like the moment you said that, like my brain started just, wheels started spinning really, really fast, because I feel like there's something about that that completely relates to,
I don't remember that at all. So cool.
Well, there's the hallucination of Ivan later, and who he hallucinates, and how he's dressed, and why he's dressed that way, and the nature of that character.
I'm gonna go ahead and cut you off because we're giving away too many future clues. Let's not talk cryptically about the future of the book.
Well, I'm just saying you need to remember what you said about that, because it'll be critical for, you need to bring that up later again.
Yeah, please help us remember that, actually, because I think that's a great point.
And I was going to bring up, I mean, I haven't read the book before, so I don't know any of the future stuff, but from the very beginning introduction of the book about Ivan's pride of having to live with all these other families as he was growing up, I mean, that's perfectly relevant.
Yeah, you're right. And I think it's worth just remembering that the society this is taking place in is a society that suggests, you know, if someone offends your honor, you better challenge them to a duel, you know? It's clearly much more important in a very public way at that time to maintain your honor than it is now. It's even hard to understand. Like the fact that Snegiryov, by social standards, should have challenged Dmitri to a duel because he was so dishonored, but because of his humiliating position in life is unable to do so without risking, you know, his family being left in absolute abject poverty. And so he can't even challenge them to a duel, even when his son is tugging his sleeve and being like, Dad, you have to defend your honor. You know, you're letting me down. This is a crushing humiliation for him. And I think it's hard to understand that in this day and age. Like, and here you see how much the social convention is at war, completely at war with what Zosimo's talking about.
That's a really good reminder.
People are challenging people to duels constantly over like trifles by our standards, you know. I want to talk a little bit about Ilyusha and this I find that one of the most poignant things in these chapters is when the captain explains what his son had to go through, and the revelations he had. I'm having trouble finding the page, but you see, Ilyusha's trying to figure out any way he can to kind of redeem the situation and restore honor to the family. And he has a couple different ideas. One is that he will challenge Dmitri to a duel, and when he grows up. And the captain says, well, duels are actually wrong. It's wrong to kill somebody. And so then he has the idea like, well, I'll challenge him to a duel, I'll disarm him, and then I'll say, I forgive you, you know. And then his other idea is middle of page 207, when they're on a walk. Poppy asked Papa, is it true that the rich are stronger than anybody in the world? Yes, Ilyusha, I said, no one in the world is stronger than the rich. Poppy said, I'll get rich. I'll become an officer, and I'll beat everybody, and the Tsar will reward me. Then I'll come back, and nobody will dare. And, you know, the captain explained some of the other sort of struggles he went through. Did you guys feel crushed by that too?
Oh, God, yes. My heart just broke on that page.
And it's so much worse when you know what's coming, too.
Stop it.
Yeah. Michael, you got to stop that kind of stuff.
You're killing me, Small. Yeah, I feel like a lot of kids have had that moment of, our town's not a very good town, is it? Oh. People are universally terrible.
Just the whole line, no one in the world is stronger than the rich. I mean, that resonates so much with, like, pretty much all my problems with the world at the moment.
Yeah, I think it's incredibly apropos to our current world, you know. I think it's just another very poignant scene to imagine. Dmitri is hauling a man out of the bar by the beard and dragging him through the street by the beard, and the kid is running alongside, clasping Dimitri's hand, saying, please forgive him, please forgive him. And to think what kind of person you'd have to be to go on dragging this guy by the beard while his 9-year-old begs you for mercy, you know? And to think what that kid went through and the public humiliation, and like, this is the sort of moment when he realizes people aren't good, you know? You did everything right, and people are still terrible to you. You know, you even asked for forgiveness, and, you know, he tried to intercede for him, and it didn't work. And I think what that kid went through is crushed, and then all his classmates, you know, start making fun of him, and he starts fighting the whole world. It's just really tragic. It's really hard and sad to see this kid coming face to face with the injustice of the world at age 9 in such a brutal way. I think that's, I don't know. Part of what I like about reading this book is how much it puts the brokenness of the world right in your face, you know? And I think this is one of those chapters. And Dostoevsky seems particularly what's the right word? I don't know, particularly compassionate and particularly tuned into the suffering of children.
I don't know what to say. I mean, you said it. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm not doing a good job at asking open-ended questions that invite.
No, but I mean, you made a great point. It's just like, yeah, what you said.
It's a good rhetorical question, perhaps.
All right. Well, I'm right. Good.
Also, McGee, we want your input. We don't just want you to be like classroom discussion leader. I mean,
Thank
we
you.
want you to be part of the group. So
Yeah.
Thank you for reminding me that.
Do not have shame of your opinions.
Junior Bear agrees.
I just think that, again, this is such a psychologically insightful part of the book. You know, he really understands what this kid is going through. This kind of surprising twist in the captain where he has to defy everybody and smashes his own future to make himself feel better. I've been in that place in arguments when I feel like I'm in a corner and people know I suck, you know, and I look terrible. Yeah, I'm ready to go to any length to restore my opinion of myself or whatever. If it means smashing my whole future and destroying everything, I understand that. You know, if you get in this desperate position, and that's what's, I think, really insightful is how many people so easily get in that desperate position. We might think, you know, it might seem easy to judge such a person, but I think I can recognize myself in this and be like, boy, it would, as Micah said earlier, but for the grace of God, there go I, you know. I just haven't come to such a desperate position maybe. But I can certainly understand. And I think that's the surprising twist that gives us an insight into ourselves on how self-destructive we can be. And I think this whole section of the book shows a lot of people making very self-destructive choices. You know, they seem not to make sense on the surface. Like, why would anyone do something so stupid? Like follow Dimitri to the ends of the earth, you know, when he rejects you. Throw away your future and trample on the money that could save your children, you know. It's I think that's just a profound insight to human nature. Before we wrap up, as promised, I think we should talk a little bit about Alyosha, who's caught in the middle of all this, and we haven't really said much about him. And you know, I'm curious how you guys are feeling about Alyosha at this stage in the book. The question I would pose is Alyosha, is he acting? Let me just put it real plain and simple. Is Alyosha codependent, or is Alyosha? Should we emulate him? Is he being held up as a good example here, or is he sort of fumbling his way through things he doesn't understand out of codependency, wanting to make everyone happy, or is he a force for good to emulate? So let me pose that question.
can I answer by saying I think both?
Sure.
Paradox, perhaps. I think maybe he does seem like he's kind of bumbling around in the world, you know, so to speak. Not quite sure of what he's doing, but I think he strikes me as coming at it with that kind of naivete and that kind of sweetness, kind of innocence, good intentions that that I think is good to emulate. I don't know.
I would say that both with a couple points on top of it. I mean, he is clearly young and bumbling and trying to like figure his way out. He's doing as he's told with good intent, I think. You know, he's kind of Boy Scout. He's kind of bumbling. He's kind of bumbling Boy Scout. But sometimes a lot of it almost reads like he's a plot furthering device for some periods of time, where like he reads like cardboard almost as a means to like reflect others. But he keeps sneaking in these like, but I'm Karamazov. So I'm waiting. I feel like that's foreshadowing something where he will um, deepen or show the traits of Dmitri and Fyodor in some capacity. That's what I'm anticipating in some way. Because he keeps saying that, but he's imperfectly trying to be good at this point.
I mean, I guess I just I have some amount of faith in Father Zosima, who told him he's supposed to go out in the world. And even as Zosima's dying, he's like, no, man. Well, he doesn't say no, man. He says, getting tired here.
No, man, your place is in the world, bruh.
Basically, yeah. To paraphrase, that is pretty much what Zosima says to him. So that's where, okay, see, I'm getting so tired, but that's where it seems to be. If that is where, I don't know how to say it other than in like orthodoxies, like if that is Alyosha's martyrdom, right? If his suffering, if his path is supposed to be going out into the world to suffer and struggle, and that's his path to holiness, maybe this is all terrible and stupid, and he's growing from it spiritually because his elder told him that this terrible crap could be transformed into something life-changing. But that's like this whole theological thing to unpack, and it is late, and I don't know that we have time to get into all that. But that's what I think.
I like that idea.
I think you're right, but I never even had ever thought that Alyosha was codependent, and just hearing those words associated with his behavior, it was almost wounding, because like I'm that person who wants to hold the sign that says I believe in Alyosha, but but he might be saint, but just because he's saintly and good doesn't mean he can't also be codependent too. Oh.
You know, the reason I brought that up is because I specifically remember conversation groups when we read this at the Oregon Extension. They're all like, Alyosha doesn't have any of his own feelings. He just tries to please everyone else. Like, I remember people kind of complaining about the character. You know, the author himself did do quite a bit of sort of apologizing for him at the beginning of the book, saying like, I know you're probably not going to understand why he's my hero, but I'm just telling you, he's the hero. So I think it's worth talking about him from time to time. Like, is he the hero and why, you know? I don't know what my take on it is. I find one really interesting moment to be when he allows himself to speak ardently to Katerina, and basically calls her an actor. He says, this whole thing is like a scene from a comedy, and you're playing this role, and it all sounds fake, and it's bullcrap, you know? And you love this guy, and let me bring Dmitri here and unite your hands, and you know, stop messing around. You don't love Dmitri. Like, get over it. Then how crushed he feels for having said that. He really rebukes himself very hard for that. You know, I wonder if he's being too hard on himself for speaking up there. What do you guys think?
Yeah, I think he's being too hard on himself.
I think it's the development of his character over time. To be honest, like I think he kind of started out with like a blank slate, and now he's like kind of getting involved with the world and kind of getting various experiences under his belt, and like kind of taking steps towards becoming more like the elder. But like they're kind of like small steps, and it's like, does he actually know what he's doing, or is he like kind of taking bad steps and falling down and kind of getting there? But it's like kind of like that process, I think, that he's on the path towards. That's kind of my read.
That's a nice read. And
Yeah.
he makes a he sort of takes his reflection on that experience and makes a note to self, like, next time I'll have to be a little more guarded and not, maybe I'm right, but maybe this wasn't the way to say it,
Yeah, there's a passage. I don't remember what it's in. I need to look it up, but I think it's Dostoevsky when he says, Socrates said that before you speak, you should ask, is it true, is it kind, and is it useful? And Dostoevsky writes that those who naturally speak what is truthful and kind must still go through a long and painful process of discovering what is useful. And I feel like
nice.
I feel like that's what the elder wants Alyosha to go out in the world for. It's like, okay, you got the truth and the kindness down, but unless you know how to say what's useful, you can't be a good elder.
That was really insightful. I want to add a layer to that, and this is coming from outside the book, but this is from the Orthodox world, from Russia in particular. There's a prayer that's very popular to say at the beginning of the day, a morning prayer, asking God to guide your footsteps throughout the day and bless all your relationships with other people. One of the really poignant lines in it is, I might just have to say the whole thing.
Do it.
All right. God, grant me to greet the coming day in peace. Help me in all things to rely upon your holy will. In every hour of the day, reveal your will to me. Bless my dealings with all who surround me. Teach me to treat all that comes to me throughout the day with peace of soul and with firm conviction that your will governs all. In all my words and deeds, guide my thoughts and feelings. In unforeseen events, let me not forget that all are sent by you. Teach me to act firmly and kindly without embittering or embarrassing others. That's the line I was looking for. Teach me to act firmly and kindly without embittering or embarrassing others. I think that's a skill that the elder embodies. Everyone can be at ease with him. Even Fyodor, he doesn't condemn. He puts him at ease somehow. He doesn't embarrass him. He can speak words of rebuke gently in a way that doesn't set people off. Even a clown like Fyodor has to admit, you're right. Like, this is why I do some of these things, because I feel bad about myself. And he says it in a gentle way that doesn't, make him have to defend himself. And so maybe that's what's missing from this little exchange. Maybe Alyosha is completely right, but he says it in a way where Katerina feels like her honor is crushed or whatever, and has to sort of, it doesn't allow her to have the gentle confrontation with what she's has going on in her heart. It kind of forces a collapse of the facade that exposes her nakedness to everyone. And then she has to run away in humiliation. So maybe there is something to Alyosha feeling a little bit bad about that moment, based on what Micah said about, learning to embody the elders' methods and what's useful,
Yeah, I think I agree when people were saying he was too hard on himself, because I think he's being too harsh, but I do think he didn't approach it great, and I love everything that everyone is saying about what they were saying. See, I'm getting tired. I can't say the words.
I think the way you put that too about exposing her nakedness fits perfectly with the literary idea of shame, in the sense that she doesn't feel like it's good that if the facade is taken aside, but it's when we it's that kind of that negative sense of self that is evoked when we're naked in public. That's the crushing thing. So I think that maybe you were going for that when you said nakedness, but I feel like that's the perfect word that you used.
Yeah, it was accidental. I'm glad you brought that into focus. And I think that is the dynamic that's motivating so many characters in this section. It's certainly that sense of shame that's driving Captain Snegurov to stamp on the money, that he's been publicly exposed, that his son has seen him publicly exposed, and that he can't do anything to to sort of rectify that. So his one option is just to turn down someone else's help.
May I ask a question?
Mm-hmm.
Is there a relationship with like Alyosha not knowing how to deal with someone else's nakedness very well? Is there then a parallel with his dealing with Katerina and then his dealing with, say his name for me, I can't do it.
Sniggy.
I feel like that was, isn't it interesting how in both cases he says like he's offering the right idea, but somehow like his inability to like approach someone in their moment of utter nakedness and powerlessness is why it goes off the rails.
Well, that's a really interesting idea, and I think you might be right, because he gets a little too. In the case with Captain Snegiryov, it's like he gets a little too gushing and syrupy, you know, to the point that it makes the other man feel like, boy, this is not honorable. This is getting giddy, you know. I think you might be right about that. Although it also ties into my codependency question, like how much can you actually control other people's reactions, you know? Is he trying too much? But yeah, I do think that that's a really great insight, is like maybe he has the right intention, but hasn't learned quite how to relate to other people that don't have his same motives, you know, like he's too pure to fully understand some of their weaknesses, maybe. Although he is a Karamazov, so he you know, he relates. Well, the clock has struck midnight, and it looks like everyone's tired. So I think we'll call it a night, unless anyone has sort of a comment that must be said. Last call.
I actually do, because I just this afternoon watched the second half of last week's when I was having connection issues. And you specifically asked when we came to a footnote about what the name of Karamazov means.
Oh, I'm glad you brought that
we
up.
We just came to it at the end of this reading, and I forgot until like 5 minutes ago. So Irina Petrovna calls him Chernomazov instead of Karamazov. The footnote says she inadvertently brings out the implicit meaning of Alyosha's surname. Cherny is Russian for black. However, in the Turkish and Tartar languages, Kara also means black. The root, mats, in Russian, conveys the idea of paint or smear. So it literally means black paint or black smear.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. So the whole name is like the sort of, you know, the blight on human nature in the face of the earth, like Karamazov, the stain of human nature or whatever. And that seems to be the thing they're all fighting with, is like this inner dark streak, you know, that that compels them to do things that they don't want to do.
Yeah. So I don't know that necessarily needs to launch another discussion now at midnight, but it's something to keep in mind throughout the book as we're going on. So I wanted to be sure and point it out.
I'm glad you did. You know, I don't feel like there's a lot of times in Dostoevsky where he's overtly symbolic or has lots of hidden meanings. I think for him it tends to be more nuances with psychological insights and contrast between characters. But I do think this is one of the ones, you know, where it's probably not accidental that he named them Karamazov, you know. And that doesn't really invite conversation, so let's wrap it up. Thank you, everyone, for joining. We will next week discuss the first half of Book 5. Book 5 is one of the real ideological cores of the book, where we start to really get into some of the philosophical and theological, like, big questions. And so I've divided it in two because they're so big, it's too much to talk about all at once. The Rebellion chapter and the Grand Inquisitor chapter are two of the really big, kind of controversial, think about this internal struggle, you know, of thought moments in the book. So a little heads up that this next section of the book is a little bit disturbing. The Rebellion chapter, I think, is challenging and disturbing. So be forewarned. But I hope everybody can join. And anyone who wasn't here this week, if you're watching this video, please make sure you can join next week, because it's going to be one of the most powerful discussions the next 2 weeks, really 3, as we also discuss the Elder Zosima chapters kind of in response to this. These are, in my opinion, the ideological core of the book. And there's going to be a lot to talk about. So if you've been reading along, you've been sitting out, or you're a little bit behind, catch up, because you want to be here to talk about these ones. Don't miss out. This is some of the coolest parts of the book. All right. I'll sign out. Good night. Thanks for joining.